we've got in common is we're both criers. So I was sat there and I was like thinking, oh God, I forgot the tissues again. So you'll have to forgive me if I sniffle a bit. Thank you, Brenton, for that gorgeous welcome to country and for sharing your experience with us. I would really like to pay my respects to elders past and present of this beautiful land that we work and play and live on. As you can tell by the accent, I'm both an immigrant and a migrant. I was lucky enough to live in Sydney for 20 odd years, and when we moved here, I literally couldn't believe my luck, not just because of the beautiful place, but because my kids are now ensconced in a place where learning Aboriginal language is seen as the norm, not seen as something special. And I think that's something we should all celebrate, and I know that's come from the really hard work of elders across this community over many, many years. So thank you. It is really an honour to be part of this forum, and I'm grateful for the invitation. And of course, I always think you're after my money, Kerry. I've never been so handsome or so funny as Dr. But I'm here with two hats. I am a resident of Bellingen, and I feel very, very lucky to call this place home. And the other, as Kerry said, is the CEO of the Siddle Family Foundation. And in that role, my job is to understand what's going on in both the Northern Rivers and the Mid-North Coast, particularly with the housing, as we're now calling it, crisis. So it's beautiful to see lots of members of the Northern Rivers here as well. So you can imagine my luck when I rock up and I meet Housing Matters Action Group. If it's my job to find the good things that are going on in communities around housing that are driven by the community, you can imagine that I was completely stoked when I met the diverse group who are actually tackling the problem here across the Shire. And the thing that really struck me is that it's not just enough to want things to change, you actually have to change yourself as well. And that's what I've really learned hanging out with the Housing Matters Action Crew, is that they're not worried about actually changing the way that they do things in order to create change for the whole of us. And that is really special, because mostly we all go on about how things need to change, but as soon as it means that we have to do something differently, actually we don't want to know about that. But don't just take my word for it. Recently, Her Excellency, the Honourable Margaret Beazley, the Governor of New South Wales, rocked up across the region, and she reflected that after travelling across New South Wales to remote and regional communities, she had been completely distressed about the number of stories that she'd heard about the housing crisis. But this was the first time that she'd actually heard of the way that locals were tackling it in such a lot of different ways and actually getting some traction. Similarly, the Honourable Rose Jackson, Minister for Housing, Homelessness, Water, Youth, and the North Coast. I mean, I think I'm busy. I don't know how she does it. She noted that the regions continue to discuss the problem, but here in Bellingen we're focused on the solutions and are actually doing it. And of course, we've already heard that we can't do this without total bipartisan support across all levels of government. I know our local member for Oxley, Mr. Michael Kemp, is an apology, but I've been told over and over again what a difference he's made. And of course, our federal member here today, Pat Conahan, has been absolutely instrumental. And you heard Emma say, contemplating 8 to 10 homes, and now you just heard we've got 23 homes that are going to open within the month. I mean, it really is exceptionally special, and what a result for us all. So we know there aren't any silver bullets, but here in Bello, we definitely have something special, the collective spirit to do it differently. So we're going to hear from Alan, we're going to hear a bit more from Kerry, who's going to take Alan's kind of national view and make it really local. And then afterwards, you're going to get the chance to ask Alan and Kerry and Dr Michael Darcy, who's the Vice Chair of Housing Matters Action Group, some questions. But remember, we're after questions. I'm going to cut you off if it's like long statements or monologues, because we don't have the time kind of for that. So let me introduce the three. I mean, again, don't really need to do Kerry, but let me introduce the three people and then we'll hand over to Alan. So Dr Michael Darcy, he's a prominent researcher in social housing policy, and has long been involved with Shelter and the Tenants Union. Like I say, he's the Vice Chair of Housing Matters Action Group, and on a recent trip where we were looking at land, it really struck me as he was commenting on why one was better than the other, that I've really learnt a lot from you, Michael. It's been a real pleasure being in this group. You all know what a powerhouse Kerry Pearse is. I mean, I'm sure some of you actually are like, oh, I just want to do my shopping, Kerry. I don't want to have a talk about community advocating and housing matters. But there is no one better. And Kerry, like I say, is going to take the kind of national challenge, but also give some real local data to us to show how far we've come from that film, but actually how we are still in this crisis. But first we'll hear from Alan Kohler. He's a renowned finance journalist, he's the ABC finance reporter, and he's going to delve into the deep-rooted issues behind Australia's housing crisis. If you haven't listened to Alan's quarterly essay, The Great Divide, Australia's Housing Mess and How to Fix It, then I'd really recommend it. And if you're like me, a member of Audible, then it's actually free. So, you know, you can listen to it in your car. I'm not sure that's helpful for Alan, but, you know, more people might read it. But when Alan gets here, his analysis has really helped me. Like I said, as an immigrant and a migrant, that quarterly essay has really put everything into content and context for me. It's made me understand the historical evolution and the policy complexities around housing in Australia. But he's made it really clear that I was naive enough to think that this was a new problem. But he's made it really clear in that quarterly essay that we have missed a number of opportunities over the last decades to make a difference. That we actually could have stopped this from getting to where we are today. And that actually there are opportunities for us to stop this from happening and make a different story for the people that we heard in the film. So without further ado, let's hand over to Alan.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I wish I could be there in person in your beautiful part of the world. But I can't, but it's great to be part of your forum. And can I just say, to begin with, that I think what is... Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think what's going on in Bellingen and your community is the solution, actually, to the national solution. And I'll get on to why in a moment. But I just thought I'd give you a bit of background on the quarterly essay and what motivated me to do it, and then, you know, how I went about doing it. Because I've been a journalist for a long time, and my kind of work involves basically daily stuff, writing columns, appearing on the news each day. So I very rarely delve into a subject deeply, but the publishers of the quarterly essay approached me at the beginning of last year to see if I wanted to do an essay on housing. And at the time, my kids were the 3 kids, all of them were in the process of trying to buy their first house, as it happens, and were struggling with the prices. So I thought, well, this is something that's important. I need to have a crack at it. So I did. The way I approached it was that I thought the best thing to do would be to figure out what has happened and when it happened, because I thought that would kind of inform the solution, or at least tell me more about what had gone on. So I thought, well, let's do it in terms of my own family. What did my parents pay for a house that I was brought up in, and then what did I pay for the house versus income? You know, because the price of a house is not kind of relevant or meaningful on its own. You've got to look at it in terms of its relationship to income. And so I kind of figured out what my parents would have paid, roughly, and what the more importantly, what the average house price was when they bought their house in 1951, and what my dad would have been getting paid as a carpenter. And the answer is that the house price in those days was 3 to 4 times incomes. And when I bought my first house with my wife in 1980, we also paid 3 or 4 times our income for the house. That was kind of, so it was the same. And it's now clear that the house price to income ratio is double that now, 7 to 8 times, 8 times probably. So that's a big change. So the question is, when did that happen? And so I found this chart. I don't know if you can see this. I'll hold it up. I didn't have slides for the thing because I only had one slide. It's this one. I don't know if you can see that. But basically what that shows, that's a house price to income graph. The line that's on top is house prices, the one at the bottom is incomes. And what's clear is, and it was clear to me, that house prices took off in the year 2000. So, okay, I thought, well, what happened in the year 2000? And the answer I soon discovered was that the capital gains tax was discounted by 50% in September 1999. Up to that point, the capital gains tax was introduced in 1985, and up to that point, you basically added any capital gain to your income minus the effect of inflation. In September 1999, that was changed to being a 50% discount. So you only added half the capital gain to your income when paying tax. So that's the situation with capital gains tax now. And we've had negative gearing for a long time, and obviously the capital gains tax discount added to negative gearing. Now, I've had a lot of feedback. I kind of highlighted that being a big deal at the time, and I've had a fair bit of feedback from various experts who say that if you do the maths on that, the impact, the financial impact of that on house prices is very small. But I don't think that's the main thing. I mean, I think what happened in the year 2000 is that housing became a market, an investment market, and basically what we have here is a need, a human need, and an essential service that's become an investment market. And investment markets involve investors, obviously, and speculators. And the thing about investment markets is that the return has to be greater than the cost of the capital. With investors, whether they know it or not, whether, if you're an individual, you're probably not that engaged in cost of capital, but professional investors are. Institutions, super funds are engaged in the question of what's the cost of capital, and I have to get a return that's greater than the cost of capital. With housing, the cost of capital is the interest rate, obviously, and if you're also if you're not borrowing money, then it's the opportunity cost of whatever else you could do with the money. And so once housing becomes an investment product, then it has to earn its cost of capital and more, because you've got to get a return greater than the cost of capital. So suddenly, instead of it being a human need, a place to live, and it's become something that has to provide a return each year, which is the rental return plus the capital gain. And the thing is that this doesn't just apply to investors. I mean, you might be thinking, oh, well, this is just about big investors who own lots of houses and all that stuff. It also applies to owner occupiers, because as I'm aware with my children, people now, when they buy a house, they see that as the way that they're going to build wealth. It's not just a place to live anymore, it's a way to build wealth. And it's not just for investors. Everybody sees housing as the way you're going to build wealth. And that is, in my view, that's inimical to being something where you're providing a human need. So what needs to occur is some way of getting out of that mindset. It's a mindset that actually changed, in my view, in the year 2000. Everyone thought about the whole thing differently. Negative gearing and the discount of capital gains tax changed the way people think. And then the other thing that happened at the same time was that on July the 1st, 2001, the federal government at the time changed the rules for international students. And instead of, up to that point, there were two categories of international students. There were those from gazetted countries and those from non-gazetted countries. And gazetted countries were able to come in and study in Australia really easily. And the gazetted countries, as you can imagine, were UK, Canada, US, New Zealand, and so on. The non-gazetted countries included China and India, Philippines, Bangladesh, and so on, Asian countries. On July the 1st, and in some ways it was a hangover from the White Australia policy, you know, the fact that we distinguished between various countries at the time. And so what happened on July the 1st, 2001, is that the government removed the distinction between gazetted and non-gazetted countries, and they also at the same time improved the transparency and the process of moving from being an international student to being a permanent resident. And so that really changed the way immigration works in Australia. And so by the year 2008, total net overseas migration in Australia had tripled from roughly 90 to 100,000 people a year, which it had been for decades before that, to 300,000 per annum, mainly because of the increase in international students. Now, I think that change to the international students was necessary. I mean, the idea that we distinguish between people from India and China and those from UK and America and so on was terrible and it needed to end. But they basically didn't do anything else. All they did was just do that, and they removed any caps, and at the same time they reduced the funding for universities. So the universities were desperate to recruit international students and were able to do so from India and China in a way that they hadn't been able to before. And so suddenly a whole industry sprung up of commission agents in those countries, in India and China, who were paid 15% commission to recruit students for Australian colleges and universities. And obviously, the thing is that these universities and colleges see these people as not migrants, but as customers who are providing them with revenue. And so the level of immigration increased at that time, by triple, and stayed there basically. The Labor Party came in 2007, didn't change the settings as you'd expect, because they weren't going to fund the universities either. And so the level of immigration in Australia, and I should say here that there are two types of immigration. There's temporary and permanent. Permanent is capped and controlled. Temporary immigration is uncapped entirely, and that includes international students, working holidays, temporary skilled migrants that companies bring in. So the temporary migration is uncapped and is driven by demand by whoever it is, whether it's companies requiring short-term workers or in the main situation, universities and colleges requiring customers. And so that was a fundamental change to the way migration works in Australia, and that kind of added to the pressure that was caused by the change in thinking about housing that occurred in 2000 as a result of the capital gains tax discount. And so housing had become an investment market, and at the same time demand for housing was increased dramatically as a result of the increase in migration. And obviously the pandemic resulted in zero migration for a while, for a year or so. House prices continued to go up, so that indicated that it isn't just about migration, because there was zero migration. And then, since then, there's been a massive boom in migration to more or less catch up, but it's more than caught up from the gap that occurred during the pandemic. And so there have been two big periods of housing shortage in Australia. One was the period from 2007 to 2015, when this big burst of migration first occurred, and also the burst of investment occurred as a result of the capital gains tax discount. There was a shortage, there was a 10-year shortage of housing. And then there's been another shortage of housing over the last few years because of the big increase in migration. Now, the other point I want to make about it before I run out of time is that housing is a different kind of market. We see obviously there's lots of markets around. There's the share market, and there's markets for commodities and so on. But housing is different. Firstly, because with the share market, it goes up and down, and the shares can fall, and sometimes do fall by 30 or 50%. There's a crash, and that's because a lot of people sell. Obviously, there's a stampede of selling, which happened in October 1987 and the GFC and so on, and that drives share prices down a lot. That doesn't happen with housing because you can't sell. And people don't sell unless they're unemployed. The house prices, or the wave of selling of house prices, only really responds to increases in unemployment. So it isn't like the share market, because housing is not like a share that you can easily sell, it's not that sort of market. And the other reason it's a different kind of market, which is similar, is that it's not an elastic product. It can't respond to pricing signals. So, for example, I've just been looking at the lithium market, just as an example. The lithium market, big increase in price, huge response from lithium companies to increase supply. There's a lot of exploration. Mines open up everywhere. Price crashes, right? Price is down 80%. Went up, 80%, then down 80%, because of the big supply response. But the thing about housing is that there can't be that kind of, and isn't that kind of supply response, because you can't build housing quickly to respond to a price signal. You've got to get planning permits. You have to get, you've got to get construction. You've got to get materials. You've got to get labour. There's not enough construction labour. So it's a very unresponsive market. So even though prices have gone up steadily, as we've seen over the past 25 years, there hasn't been a supply response that there normally would be in a market. There normally would be, but there can't be because of the zoning restrictions, and the capacity of the construction industry to build houses is limited. And I should say, as part of that, the proportion of migrants who are in the construction industry is very small. I think it's less than 1% of migrants actually are tradies who can help build the houses that are needed to house them. Most of the migrants, particularly international students, are obviously not doing that. They're delivering food or doing whatever they can to get by. So the capacity of the housing industry is constrained by the lack of labour, also the cost of materials, but also zoning restrictions that are there. Now, one of the things I did in the quarterly essay was to show how the nature of our cities developed over time, so that we don't have dense cities. We have very spread out cities in Australia. That's the way people like it. It happened because of the fact that our cities were developed after cars became very affordable, so everyone had a car, didn't have to worry about being close to the city to ride a horse to the city, as they did in Europe and America, where those cities were developed. And so we've got spread out cities. Everyone likes it that way. They don't really want to have rows upon rows of 10-storey apartment buildings in the cities. And so there's a bit of pushback now. Densification, in particular New South Wales and Victoria are trying to densify the cities, and Victoria, I know for sure, and I'm not sure about New South Wales, but Victoria has given all the councils around Melbourne a target that they have to have houses built, or lots that have to be released. And the councils are all up in arms now. Crikey, we can't do that. In most places, most local government areas, It's double the number of houses they have to come up with over the next 20 years. And they're supposed to do it by raising the height limits around their train stations. Well, you know, they're all kind of pursing their lips and wondering how they're going to do that, because they'll get voted out. So look, I think that there's a lot of difficulty here. I think I'm out of time. I'm supposed to talk for 15 minutes. Look, I'm very happy to answer questions when the time comes. So perhaps we can get stuck into it more after that. So thanks very much for listening to my little talk, and good on you for having this thing today.
Thanks, Alan. And whilst Kerry's just getting her notes, think about those questions. Make them really hard, but don't make them long. So that's the challenge for you. This week I've just been in Kempsey with actually quite a lot of people who are here with social impacts in the regions, and actually, as Alan was talking about, one of the presentations was a community housing provider, and they've got a plan for 1,600 new homes across Melbourne in the next 5 years, and they showed us the places where they were replacing 23 homes in a space with 400 and odd homes. And even though talking about that medium density was needed, you could see people like having a bit of a reaction to having those traditional homes being knocked down and that medium density housing being built, which is what Alan kind of calls for in his quarterly essay. Are we ready, Kerry? Great. Come on over and tell us what's happening locally in the Bellenden Shire.
Well, I'm not a data head. I'm feeling just a tad nervous about presenting myself as if I am. But I think we're all really interested in understanding what's going on, and so I have spent a bit of time delving into the census data. I've decided just to keep it high level. I know there are some people here who are really interested in data, and I'm really happy to have a longer talk about it or answer some questions, but we'll just do the top line story. And just want to start by, of course, thanking Alan for setting the scene and helping us get our heads around what's happened nationally. Oh, I have to work the thing. Hang on.
Point at me.
Point at you?
Yeah.
It's not...
Press the power button.
That one?
That's what before. Oh, I can do it
You
manually.
might have to drive it. Okay, so... This is going to be a bit... I mean, can I hold this in my hand? That would be much easier, thanks. Then I can see it too. So I'm not going to read what you can all see, except to say that most of us here live in the most glorious, wonderful place on Gumbaynggirr country. It's a very different story to live in a rural area like ours than even a bigger regional centre like Coffs Harbour or Port Macquarie. I was interested when I had a look at the census data and Council's website saw that only 1% of that 1,602 square kilometres is zoned residential land, 1%. And much of our shire is state and forest and national park and agricultural land. So I thought that was very interesting. We know we're an older population, that's not news to us, but we have had an influx of older people moving in over the last period of time, and that's pushed the age up a bit. You can see the regional New South Wales median age is 43, ours is 50, apart from, of course, that First Nations residents whose age is much younger, and that's how it is nationally, also with bigger families. The proportion of First Nations people has increased quite a lot between the last two censuses to 4.3%. This next one's really interesting. We have a lot more homeowners who own their homes outright than many other places, and much higher than the regional New South Wales median. So 45.5% of households are in homes that are owned outright. And we have a lower median weekly household income than the rest of regional New South Wales. So that gives you the big picture. Nothing's changed since the film that you saw earlier. We have a big supply of 3 and 4 bedroom homes, hardly any 1 and 2 bedroom homes. And we now have quite a lot of homes that are occupied either by childless couples or single people living alone. So I think I talked a bit about what's changing. We had a big influx between the 2016 and 2021 census of people over 60 and also people over 70 moving into the Shire. And young people were leaving in big numbers, although we did get an uptick of young people in the local workforce, which is good news. Single parent families are starting to leave. That was clear in the 2021 census data. And also, interestingly and not surprisingly, because this is what we can see happening, there was a big uptick of professionals moving into the Shire. In fact, 164 professionals moved into the Bellinger Valley. The census data looks at the Bellinger and the valleys over that period. And really interestingly, there was a big increase in the number of people proportionally, who work from home. And we think that means their line of sight is back to employers in other places, often on bigger wages, or they're self-employed and able to do the sort of techno-working gig, which means that your work isn't physically based in where you're living. And the other thing that changed is that the income quintiles changed, and we had people moving out of the middle, bigger, lower income quartile, so people on very low incomes, that group grew, and people on high incomes grew, and the middle thinned out. So we're starting to see that sort of stratification and a bit more of the gap in the middle and the haves not. Just a little bit more about First Nations people who live in the Bellinger Shire. As I said before, younger and with more children. And interestingly, Brenton, actually 28% in the census data are buying their own home. So they may not be people who are actively engaged in community activity. I noticed you referenced before, but I thought that was an interesting stat because they have mortgages.
He introduced me.
Put the word out. More First Nations people rent significantly more than the rest of the community. Households are a bit bigger, and there are more multi-generational and multi-family households in the First Nations community group, and most of the First Nations people living in our Shire are working. So this is an interesting slide which just sort of delves into housing tenure and shows you the sort of disproportionate number of fully owned homes, which isn't a surprise in a way if you understand that we've had a big sort of influx of older people moving in, often from the cities, who are able to buy outright. Bellinger Shire actually has come up in the list of the top 10 locations where people buy their homes in cash, which just reinforce, these stats reinforce that. Interesting that, we're a bit skewed and we have fewer people on mortgages in regional New South Wales and fewer people renting. We have hardly any social housing in this Shire and the surrounding areas, and that's a really big problem. There's just nowhere for really low income earners to have secure housing. And we do have, and I meant to say this in my opening remarks, so I'll say it now, we do have a tradition of multiple occupancies in this Shire, and I just want to acknowledge the people who are here in this room who did the hard yards getting government changes to multiple occupancy legislation decades ago, which was really the forerunner around innovation around affordable housing and the forerunner for the work that our group is doing now. So I can see a few faces here. That group often is what shows up in the other tenure type, but they've had a disproportionate influence in our community and maintaining our diversity. Thanks, Emma. So Alan talked about the house to income ratio story. I bought my first house when I was in my 30s. I know that just looks like yesterday, right? I was earning $30,000 a year. I was in Canberra, I was a public servant, and my house was $161,000. And that was in 1995. So things have changed a lot since then, and I was doing that on one income, and that was feasible. Changed, the income rates went up over that period, and I ended up, I had been on a honeymoon interest rate, had to move out, actually got me living with my partner, who we're still together 32 years later, so that interest rate rise was probably quite a good thing. But because the mortgage repayments weren't nearly as high, I could cope with that issue, and there was also negative equity when the government changed. But all of that you could ride through. It's not the same story now for people who are younger than me. In regional New South Wales in 1994, it was on average in the country 3 times of your annual wage you could buy a house. It's 14 times in the Bellingen Shire now. That's current stats. People, when I've had this conversation with them, sometimes say, well, people have always had to move where the houses are cheaper. Maybe people just need to travel a bit further for work. Well, that's pretty self-explanatory there. The gap between local wages and house prices is so great, and I'm no economist, but and there are very esteemed economists and planners and academics in our room today, but I would say that we never will get back, in my view, to a situation where we're talking about the income house price ratio that used to be. And if we did, it would be such a serious economic adjustment that there would be so much pain. So we need to be thinking about what we can do differently. This is really interesting, and this was a surprise to me. So I started thinking about what's the implications of having such a big group of people who own their own home outright, and what does that mean in terms of the stats that we're seeing around housing stress. So I did a bit of a calculation, and I removed that group of people from the cohort of, when we talk about housing stress, we're usually looking at it as a proportion across all households. So if you actually look at the group of people who don't own their own home outright, so they're either mortgagees or they're renters, and you look at the affordability data, 18% of households in our shire are in housing stress from that group. So if they're mortgagees or they're renters, that's 1 in, I think, 5.5 households are in housing stress. Now, a friend and colleague of mine said that there's another discussion to have about whether the way you think about housing stress should apply to both renters and mortgagees. So people generally know that 30% of household income is considered to be the benchmark. If you're paying more than that in housing costs, then you're in housing stress. We don't have a slide here, but actually we've crunched the numbers, and we've got a huge number of people who are paying 50 and 60 and 70% of their incomes, and they're on local wages based on median rents and mortgages. And so they're definitely in housing stress. But, there is some thinking to be done about, is that 30% benchmark the right benchmark for renters and homeowners because people are in different situations and they're building equity in capital gain if they're paying off their house. But nonetheless, given the interest rate rises and cost of living issues, understanding that proportion of households across our shire who are really in housing stress is really significant. And people say you've got to love the problem before you can find the solution. So this is part of the problem. And as you can see, a big proportion of those people are renters, but also mortgagees, particularly people who are mortgagees and they're in the middle income brackets. And on census night, there were 48 people in the Shire who were homeless. We know that there's a much bigger proportion of people who are living in their vans and couch surfing and who aren't picked up in the stats. But that was interesting to see that that's where we were in 2021. Oh. Actually don't. I'm going to tell you Sue's story. Sue, I was going to read it, but I'll just tell it to you. We put the call out for people to share their housing stories with us so that we could share those stories today. And Sue isn't really Sue, but Sue is happy for me to share her story with you now. And the other person whose story I'll just briefly mention before I tell you Sue's story is someone who shared their story with us on the plateau, who just talking about homeowners and mortgagees as I was a minute ago, who runs a small business and a partner runs a small business, and they worked really hard to save the deposit that they needed to buy into the market, and they were able to just buy in before the prices really shot up. They're people who are doing things in the Dorico community that just keep the doors open for the rest of the community so that we can eat and do the things that we need to do, and they're paying more than 50% now of their combined income through their two small businesses on mortgage payments. So that sort of story is not an unusual story in our part of the world or the rest of Australia for that matter. Sue's story is that 6 years ago Sue found herself as a single mother, homeless, with 2 children. I just need to get their ages right. In fact, I will read this to you because Sue actually cleared what I'm saying. It's just that I have page 2 and not page 1. But there's page 1. I feel much better now. Sue's 32 and a single parent with 2 children who are now in primary school and year 7. She's had extremely precarious housing for many years. 6 years ago, Sue and her children were homeless for 6 months. During that time, they camped at Urunga River until the ranger moved them on. They then went to Bellingen Showground and camped there, all during the rainy season. They stayed in a borrowed van with a bed, plus 2 tents and a gazebo. With their belongings in the tents and a borrowed stovetop and esky, the conditions were very tough, as you can imagine, during the rainy season. There was constant problems with mould, ankle-deep water in the tents and children being sick. Sue was focused on ensuring her oldest child kept going to kindergarten at the local school throughout this period. The showground has a 2-week limit, so it was very difficult to have continuity there, but the showground did what they could to help her. Over this period, Sue applied for around 250 places to rent. This extreme precarity continued until what Sue described as a nice lady stepped in and offered Sue and her children a room in her house. Eventually, Sue was able to find a house to rent in Tormina, and she stayed there for over 6 years. During this time, she went to TAFE, and became a therapeutic support worker and had a full-time job and built up some savings. That actually occupation is one of the fastest growing occupations in the Shire, because I was trawling through the census data. Sue's dream is to have her own place. I'd love to be able to buy a home and make something our own, she said. But even though she was working full-time and had built up savings for a deposit, she went to banks but wasn't able to get a mortgage to buy because the house prices were so high and they would say she wasn't eligible. Sue says, "In the bank's eyes, I didn't make enough to pay a mortgage even though the cost of rent was more than these repayments." Sue has significant carer responsibilities for one of her children who has additional needs. Given that her rental was stable and she'd saved some reserves, she decided to stop working for a period of time and concentrate on supporting her children and start her own business as a therapeutic support worker so she'd have more flexibility and could respond to the children's needs. 3 weeks later, her landlord decided to sell and her tenancy was terminated 3 months ago. So the story started 6 years ago, we're now up to 3 months ago. She started looking right away and has applied for 86 rentals in this region over that period. Sue said that there would be 40 or 50 people at each inspection, lined up along the street. She'd just look at the line of people and realise that she had no chance. Sometimes she'd see key workers, like nurses in their uniforms, and know that she was competing for a home against them. Eventually, one of the real estate agents took an interest in Sue, and when she missed out again, invited her to look at a 3-bedroom property in the Bellingen Shire before it was advertised on the open market. Thanks to the kindness of the real estate agent, Sue was successful, which should be a happy ending to this very challenging story. Except that the rent is $650 a week. That's $170 a week more than she was paying in her Tormina home. Sue's Centrelink income is $1,600 a fortnight and her rent is $1,300. She has $300 a fortnight to feed and care for her family. Her savings are almost gone. Sue will need to rely on local support services such as the pantry in St Vinny's to help her family through this time. There's simply no way that she'll be able to pay her bills and put food on the table without extra help. As soon as the children are settled, Sue's going back to work as a support worker. Theoretically, she'll be able to earn around $1,400 a week before she loses a pension and related medical benefits for her children. On a quick look at wage rates, I can see that if Sue was taking a permanent full-time role, in any case her wage would be less than the Centrelink cut-off based on the award. How we value and pay the people who look after those of us who need help in our community is another discussion for another day. If Sue's able to earn the maximum possible to still keep a minimal Centrelink payment, which allows for the health benefits, she'd be paying around 46% of her gross income in rent. Sorry, I've lost my place. Sue made the point to me that after tax and super are taken out of her income, her net income will be much lower, and working full-time isn't an option with her son having so many vital appointments. Once she's working part-time, while Sue and her family will be in a much better situation than they are right now, it will still be very tough going. During our conversation, Sue told me that she knows at least 15 other people in a similar situation. She spoke about someone she met who had to send her children to be cared for by family away from the region because she just couldn't find someone for them to all live somewhere for them all to live together. Sue talked about the only other place she was offered as a rental around the time she took the home she now lives in. It was in Tormina. It was also $650 a week, with 3 very small bedrooms and a kitchen bench instead of a kitchen, no oven, and mould through the bathroom. Sue applied for community housing some time ago, but she knows it's very unlikely that this will help. Through her work, Sue has met other people who are in even more desperate situations than she is. Their needs put them higher up the list and they still miss out due to the high demand and not enough properties. The wait list is expected to be 15 years at this stage, Sue said. It took 3 months for Sue to get an initial interview, by which time she'd found somewhere herself. She said, the wait times are just too long. I knew nothing would come out of it. Sue said that, I feel like I'm being set up for failure. I've chewed through my savings and I'm even further away from being able to get our own home. I'm hitting walls whatever I do. Sue was incredibly generous to share her story with us, and I have no doubt that she'll find a way through and continue to provide her children with a loving and safe home, despite the incredible hardship she continues to face. When I asked Sue what made her reach out to me to tell us her story, she said, something needs to be done, something needs to change. Sue has signed off that story, so I'm really glad I found page 1 as well as page 2, and I think we'd all just like to take a moment to thank Sue for being so generous. We've only got a couple of slides yet and we're nearly out of time, and I won't, this one is pretty self-explanatory. It's looking at who can afford to rent here by occupation. We've done the numbers, we update this pretty frequently. It's a pretty bleak story. Who can afford to buy? Thanks, Emma. We all like to be winners, yeah? But we're just about to have a look at a couple of awards that we might not want to be so proud of. This was published relatively recently. It was an analysis of a few different factors that the author of the report considered to be rental pain, and Urunga came up on top of the list for all of New South Wales. And Dorrigo, NCOS, which is the New South Wales Council of Social Services, published a report last year looking at after mortgage poverty, and Dorrigo was one of the highest. There was a group of 2 in the top, highest rates in New South Wales for after mortgage poverty. So I just want to close by asking us all to think about what's the impact of this housing crisis on our community. You know, what does it mean? It's not just about the stories of individuals and their families and their children, as compelling as they are. It's about, you know, how will we as a community survive, and how will we get staff to work in the places that we need people to work in to make a community live? Do we want to live somewhere where there's a growing gap between the rich and the poor? I don't think we do want to live like that. That's why we've come here, and that's why over many decades our communities have been created to be inclusive and diverse. I want to close now by saying that we're now starting to face, this crisis is now really starting to kick in, and I want to thank the Mayor and Councillor King for the work that they've been doing in advocating around what's happening at the hospital. I think most people would have caught up with the fact that there are 10 beds in Bellingen, and you might not know about 6 beds in Dorrigo that are in question about whether we lose them permanently. And there are discussions ongoing with the local health district. But the local health district has said that the beds will be there if they can attract the staff, basically, and then they're not able to attract the nursing staff, and housing is one of the contributing factors to that. So we now as a community are facing losing hospital beds and other services and the glue that makes the community work, because we can't find a way to house the people in the community who do that work. Thanks, Emma. So we're on the last slide, and I just want to bring us back to say that that's a pretty bleak tour, in a way, of where things are at. But a lot has changed. You know, that film that we saw at the beginning was made in 2019 and 2020, and now some of those initiatives are coming online. We're going to invite you to have a look at the local tour upstairs over morning tea that showcases some other things that are happening. And we have an absolutely firm belief that if we work together, we can find ways as a community to tackle this. But we have to do it together.
Okay, so I've been given the task. We've got 15 minutes. Michael, do you want to come and sit up with Kerry? So we've got 15 minutes, so it's going to be like speed dating. So I'm going to run up and down with the microphone for people who've got a question. And I'm just going to point out that Michael and Kerry are going to be here in the morning tea. So let's go and see if we've got specific questions for Alan first. Hey, okay, great.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just, with respect, Alan, I was just thinking that there was a few gaps in terms of what you were saying, in terms of understanding that there was a lot of international students that were able to come in, and then there was also the easier avenue for people to be investors as well. And I think, the question, just wondering that I think the Airbnb boom was probably just wondering whether that was also as impactful, that it was much easier to become an investor, then people could make it. And there was the need for students to live close to unis, then it was more encouraging for greedy landlords, instead of actually people being able to buy homes. Yeah, do you know what I mean? Yeah.
I wouldn't want to give the impression that the things that I mentioned in my short speech were the only things that I think caused the housing crisis. I don't think that. I mean, obviously Airbnb, the boom in Airbnb has been one of them. It's taken a lot of houses off the long-term rental market. A lot of houses. And the reason for that, of course, is because you get more money on Airbnb than you do on a long-term rental, and you get more control of the house. So, landlords are inclined to do that. So I think one of the solutions, there are many solutions required, and one of them, in my view, is that there needs to be some sort of price that landlords have to pay if they want to take their house off the long-term rental market onto Airbnb. It needs to part of the premium they get for doing so should go back to the community in the form of taxes in some way. So look, there's a bit of that. Victoria's got I think a short-term rental tax coming up, and whether that works, we'll see.
Excellent. Next question. I've got one at the back, but if there's anybody halfway, I'd be happy to stop.
Hello, Alan. Government's built social housing, but that percentage dropped from about 10% of the housing stock to, I understand, about 3% currently. What contribution did that make?
Yeah, that was another big factor. I mean, the governments have got out of the business of public housing pretty much. Just as they've got out of most other businesses, look, there was a huge wave of privatisation in the 80s and 90s. They got out of the business of airlines, banking, electricity provision, gas provision, you name it, they got out. And so I don't think that's ever going to come back. I think affordable housing is going to have to be provided by the private sector. And the way that can happen is through the Housing Australia Future Fund, which this government has set up with $10 billion in it. And the idea of the HAF, as it's called, is to subsidise the provision of affordable housing funded by institutional investors and organised by community groups such as yours. So it's all about supporting community housing groups who get their money from institutions such as, in particular, super funds, and the Housing Australia Future Fund's purpose is to close the gap between what the super funds need in terms of return and what affordable housing can actually provide in terms of a return. So there's a gap, obviously. Super funds need a return of 9% or something, and that's the last thing we want, is for house prices to continue rising at 9% or for rent plus capital gains to continue to be 9%. So that fund, the idea of the fund is to close the gap. Now, I don't think there's anywhere near enough. There's a limit to what this that can do, but it's a very good initiative, and I really like the way that it uses community groups to do it, non-profit community groups, which I think can lead to a rebirth, a big growth in the use of communities and in communities dealing with housing such as yours. So I think that's a great idea, and I think that sort of thing is the only way that affordable public housing is going to be built, in my view, because the governments aren't going to do it.
Thank you very much, Alan. My question relates to superannuation. Do you think it's suitable for purpose now, particularly for young people? If housing is a human right, they're getting, paying 11.5% or something of their wage into superannuation. They've also got HECS fees. APRA has got a 3% limit, a higher interest rate. We seem to be doing everything wrong to help young people get into the housing market in the first place. And I'd just like your thoughts on that, please.
So you'd get rid of super, would you? I'm just wondering.
Sorry,
Is that what you're saying? You wouldn't have super?
No, the impact of super on young people.
Oh well, sure. It obviously.
Yeah, sorry, Alan. What I'm saying is that you can, if you've got your house and you end up at 65 or 67, you can sort of survive on the pension if you own your own home. But if you're paying 11% of your wage all the way through and you haven't quite got the capacity to get to own your own home, then renting a place on a pension is not a good place to be. So I'm trying to solve the problem from the other way.
Yeah. Look, I think that's a valid point of view. I think obviously the idea of super is to not entirely but partly replace the age pension, because it's another form of, in a sense, it's another form of privatisation. The government basically is saying that we're going to gradually, over the decades, get out of the business of providing retirement income and leave it to the private sector, which is, you and I have to save. So it's another form of privatisation. I mean, I think far better would be the government actually just does provide it out of taxes, and we don't need super, but apparently we do. I think what you're saying is valid. But the fact is we have got super, it's not going anywhere. I think we need to deal with the reality that we have in addressing the housing crisis, and not kind of come up with solutions that aren't really going to happen, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Over the longer term, do we need better institutional structures around housing in Australia? So the housing market's complex, it's not always responsive to the right things, as you've discussed, and housing's very difficult for major political parties. It seems even difficult for some of the independents who I would have thought. So do we need better institutional arrangements around housing in Australia so it's more of a forefront public policy issue like we have for other public policy issues? Because people aren't even sure what governments are sometimes doing on housing, and it's really debated. Does it need to be like a federal national housing plan or something?
Yeah. Now look, I couldn't agree more. I think we've got a couple of institutions. There's Housing Australia, and their job is to deal with the Housing Australia Future Fund, to dish that money out. There's the National Housing Affordability and Supply Council, which was just set up last year, and they have a board. Their staff are on secondment from Treasury. They don't have many. I think they've got about 30 staff, maybe even less. Anyway, they are not sufficiently resourced, in my view. I do think there's a case for a body like the Australian Energy Market Operator that runs the energy market. Basically, AEMO, as it's called, its job is to measure supply and demand of electricity and to deal with shortages as they happen, to ensure that we don't have blackouts. And so I think that kind of body is called for in housing, so that there is an institution, as you say, whose job it is to watch the supply and demand of housing and to either recommend actions to deal with it or to actually do it. So yeah.
Thanks, Alan. I'm aware that there's a significant body of evidence in respect to mandatory inclusionary zoning, and was just curious what your thoughts were about creating, as part of the solution, a perpetual pipeline of affordable housing in Australia.
Can I ask, just before you lose the microphone, what do you mean by inclusionary zoning?
Mandatory inclusionary zoning, so any like new developments would require like a percentage of the new builds to be designated as affordable.
Oh, I see. Yeah, sure. I think that is a good idea. Absolutely. I think there's some of it going on, but perhaps not enough. And it's the sort of thing that would require a federal legislation so that it's equal across the country. We can't have a situation where each state is different. It seems to me, obviously housing is a state matter, and that's fair enough. But there are some issues that require national focus because it's something that shouldn't be different between the states, and that's one of them. So yeah, I mean, obviously, what that does, a proportion of affordable housing in a development reduces the return that's available to the developer. So you've just got to understand what that would do to the prospects of the development happening. So what you don't want to do is do it in such a way that the developments don't actually occur, and we end up with a continuation of the shortage.
Thanks, Alan. So I'm getting the wrap-up time, and this lovely woman has been waiting very patiently, so why don't you have first?
So you speak of public housing being privatised, and obviously we see community housing popping up as big corporations. We've got Origin Energy owning an Aboriginal-led organisation called Many Rivers, which is quite astounding. But on the ground, we see people who have moved from public housing into community housing are experiencing much worse conditions. It's really the Wild West out there with community housing providers. So my question is, who is regulating community housing providers? So this is a question for Michael as well as Alan. Just want to understand, how is the government managing the privatisation of our social housing?
Thanks for the great question. I'm wondering, is that an Alan question or is that a Kerry question? Alan?
I think it's...
Oh, well, as far as I'm aware, they're not really regulating it at all, but maybe I'm wrong. I mean, as far as I can tell, it is Wild West out there. The government's basically abandoned the area, and they need to unabandon it.
Michael?
Yeah, I don't think that's entirely true. As some people might remember, I was involved on behalf of the Tenants Union in doing a major piece of work on the transfer of public housing to community housing in 2018 and 19, and that's progressed since then. And it is true that what that work found is that there's vast differences between the ways that different community housing providers deliver, but they are bound to standards on certain things like rent policy and allocations and those sorts of things. We also have the registrar of community housing who ensures that they meet a certain standard. However, the fact is that the transfer to community housing hasn't really produced any increase. It was meant to or it was argued that community housing organisations would be able to expand the stock and so on, but they've never been given title to the property, so they can't borrow against it, so they can't expand, so they can only do other forms of partnership development and so on. And of course they were left with the backlog of maintenance going back 30 or 40 years on the stock that was transferred to them. So I think a lot of community housing organisations are doing a really great job, but a lot of other community housing organisations are struggling, and unfortunately one of the things that's happened is that the management, the boards of community housing organisations, in an effort to kind of professionalise, if you like, have also lost touch a bit with the tenant population, and we don't see tenants on boards anymore as we used to 20 years ago. And so, yes, effectively, it's not privatisation, but it's a kind of pushing of responsibility away from government. So without, criticising those community organisations who put their hand up and said, yes, we'll take over this responsibility of managing these tenants, yeah, the outcomes are very patchy, I think, for tenants, is the best I can say.
Thank you. I know you've probably got loads more questions, but we have unfortunately run out of time. So can we put our hands together for Alan Kohler? My question was going to be, how do you keep so optimistic when the news is so bad consistently? But I kind of know the answer to that, which is if you make your way out the doors and turn left and go and look at all the amazing stuff that's happening in Bellingen, and there's also cake as well. And if people come back at 12, then we can start with the second session.